Hello, welcome to another episode of the Tai Chi Notebook podcast. Now, Bruce Lee will be no stranger to anybody listening to this podcast. Even 50 years after his death, he remains the most famous martial artist in the world. But could he actually fight? World champions in karate competition have gone on record to point out that he never once competed in tournaments. So, were his martial abilities merely a trick of the camera? My guest for this episode is Bruce Lee authority and best-selling author John Little. John has a new book out called Wrath of the Dragon, The Real Fights of Bruce Lee, in which he takes a hard look at Bruce Lee's real fights to definitively answer these questions. To get the first-hand accounts in the book, John has tracked down over 30 witnesses to the real fights of Bruce Lee, as well as those who were present at his many sparring sessions. There are over 30 years of research in the book, and it took him thousands of miles around the globe. So here's the man himself to tell you more. John Little, what a pleasure it is to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm well, Graham. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm in the UK, where it's very hot. And you're in Canada, I believe.
I am. I understand the UK actually is hotter today than it is in Greece, which is odd. So,
Yeah. Well, they had a load of wildfires there, and while that was happening, it was raining here, so everything's gone upside down.
yeah, no kidding. Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. And I understand you're not only an internal arts practitioner, but also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner as well.
Yeah, I am. I'm a practitioner of Chinese arts in the lineage of Wong Jack Man, who had that legendary fight with Bruce.
What do you mean, from the Tai Chi one or the Northern Shaolin?
Kind of both mixed together, but mainly the Tai Chi.
Oh, okay.
It's the Guru Zhang Tai Chi style is the one I do. But he also passed down a few, well, my teacher passed down a few Northern Shaolin forms as well, which we practiced, like the two-man form and straight sword form. So it's a bit of a mix of everything. And the Choi Li Fut from his lineage as well.
Oh, wow. Well, that's pretty cool. It's always interesting to have 20th century connections to, well, I mean, most of the arts that we know of came into being for the most part in the 20th century, even though all of them claim lineage going back thousands of years in some cases. Hard to prove the further it goes back, and they sort of trail off into the dual mists of legend and myth. You know, I remember visiting the Shaolin Temple back in 2009. You know, that, of course, being from the West, we're very ignorant. My knowledge of it was from the Kung Fu TV series and then Jet Li and all of these people. And of course, there was very little in the 70s to read about the actual Shaolin because it was in ruins pretty much leading up into the 70s. And then when the Kung Fu boom hit, it became a tourist place. But it was still pretty cool to walk up to the cave where Bodhidharma was and trace that lineage, if you will. Even if it's mythological, it's still pretty cool to experience that. It does sort of kindle a certain magic, which for me I've always had sort of a love-hate relationship with the martial arts. But the love part always comes from that magical component. It just seems to excite the imagination, and to be at Shaolin was pretty cool. And the same way, your art, Tai Chi, I've always been impressed by. And there were elements of Wing Chun that did that for me. But I've always had a huge respect for Tai Chi practitioners because it seemed to offer much more than just a better way to punch somebody in the mouth.
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, sorry, I'm meandering.
That's fine, yeah. No, there's a lot of depth in Tai Chi, which is interesting. We should just tell the listeners why we're talking together, because you've written another book, which is The Wrath of the Dragon. It's coming out soon in the UK. Is it already out in the States?
It'll be out this week. I think the 5th of September. So tomorrow it'll be out.
Brilliant. I'll be honest, when I saw the title, I thought, oh no, he's done a whole book on Bruce Lee's fights. There can't be much in that. And then I'm holding the book and reading it and thinking, this is amazing. It's so thick, and your footnotes are incredible. You've got footnotes for every reference that's said in there, which is brilliant. So if you read any account of anything to do with a fight of Bruce Lee, you can just go and check out who exactly said it and when, and it's all catalogued there, which is great. So was this like a labour of love for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was. It's funny. I was one of those guys. I mean, I'm an early Bruce Lee fan. I saw Enter the Dragon when it first premiered in the theaters, so that's how old I am. As I mentioned, I think in an early chapter in that book, that once the Kung Fu explosion hit, and I know it was that way in the UK, but in North America, it went from being nothing, literally zero, to a karate school on every corner. And then Taekwondo followed. And it was very aggressive. Even back then, it was business. It was all about business. But to us, who had walked out of the theater seeing this never before seen form of self-defense, we had anything. We were ravenous for information on it. So anyway, fast forwarding, I went to the karate school, and of course they had a poster of Bruce Lee near the change room, which beckoned people in and to pay for lessons. But there was already starting a backlash against Bruce from practitioners of certain styles. And our style there was Shido-Ryu, which is a Japanese karate style. And I remember sitting in the little foyer area waiting for class to begin. And I was very proud yellow belt at the time. And the fellow who was about 30, was a green belt. And as we were sitting in the lobby, or as I was, he walked in, and they had, a little table with martial arts magazines, Karate Illustrated, Black Belt. And he picked up Karate Illustrated, and he must have heard me speaking about Bruce Lee. Because in those days, if we weren't talking about Bruce Lee, we weren't having a conversation. So he heard me and said, well, Bruce Lee couldn't fight. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, he's anytime these Chinese, he called them poison finger bullshit artists, went over to Thailand, they get carried out in a stretcher, and they're not fighters. And if you want to see a real fighter, he said, and he threw this magazine at me. He said, that guy's a real fighter. And I looked at it, and it was Joe Louis on the cover in a karate tournament. And I didn't know. I mean, what did I know in 1974? I think Linda's book had been out, and she touched on the fact that he had a few fights in Hong Kong when he was younger. And I mean, who didn't have fights when they were younger? And that he'd had a fight in Oakland with Wong Jack Man. And I think she may have referenced an encounter with an extra on the set of Enter the Dragon, but that was it. And certainly, if that's your database and you put that against someone like a Chuck Norris or a Joe Louis or anybody that fought quasi-professionally, the records pale in comparison. Guys like Hayward Nishioka, the judo man, he was a Pan Am gold medalist in judo. He was at the top of the heap. Bruce had no trophy that he could bring forth. So I felt I had no reply to this guy. I just was too ignorant. I didn't know. And so ever since then, you could say, the idea to provide an answer to this green belt has been percolating in my mind. And so now it's finally come out.
Oh, that's amazing. So it's a real catalogue. It's every single scrap he got into that anyone saw. Because he was basically fighting people all the time, having scraps all the time, it's essentially a sort of, it's the story of his life, really. And it starts off in Hong Kong when he's at school. And there are several encounters where he's at school having fights with people. And then fighting amongst Kung Fu students in Hong Kong once he starts learning Kung Fu.
Right.
And all these fights, they're pretty serious. I mean, he's always flipping out a knife or something at the same time and threatening to kill people. It's not just sort of a sporting type encounter, is it?
Not at all. No, not at all. I suspect, and I allude to it in the book, that I think his very early years contributed to that aggression in him. He was born with an undescended testicle to begin with. his parents were very superstitious and believed that bringing a young boy into the world made them a target for demons that would come and steal the souls because they had lost a son at a very early age, shortly after he'd been born. So the belief then was that the spirits, whoever these evil spirits were after the souls of young boys, young girls not so much, evidently. And so in order to confuse the spirits, they dressed Bruce as a girl. They called him Saifong, which is a feminine name. They sent him to a girls' public school. They put a dress on him at night before he went to bed. They pierced his ear. And he had to endure this gender confusing orientation up until his 9th birthday. So I think once the pretense of gender was dropped at the 9th birthday, he was determined to prove to everybody that he was male. And so what were the male characteristics? Well, you're tough, you speak with authority, you're strong, and you fight. And that's what he did. I suspect a psychologist could make a case study about that on Bruce, because it was an attitude that he carried with him right up until the day he died. He never refused a challenge. Well, I mean, professional fighters get challenged all the time. They don't accept them because they're prize fighters. It's like, you want to put $1 million on the table? Sure, we'll talk.
I'm not going to fight you for free.
I don't fight for free. Bruce never had that. For him, it was, if someone challenged him, they were challenging his masculinity. They were challenging his identity as male, and therefore it was on. And you can see that, all throughout, well, not only throughout the book, but more specifically throughout his life. He could not refuse a challenge.
No, that's the impression I'm getting.
So, yeah, that to me was an interesting thing. And the other interesting thing is, to me, was how obsessed, almost pathologically obsessed he was with fighting. Like people like yourselves who are in the arts in a big way and trained diligently for decades and look deeper into, say, the Tai Chi classics or the whatever to learn more about it. That's one thing. But what he would do was take everything had to relate to fighting, everything, his daily life. If he walked into a party, he'd immediately size up everybody in the room. Who's a threat? Who's not a threat? How would I take this guy out? If he's out eating, he's working on broken rhythm in terms of observing how people eat, what rhythms they use in their movements, and then he makes sounds in between the beat of this movement so that he could intercept them. He had created electrical devices in which loud sounds played in one ear and dripping water played in the other, and he would crank up the loud sounds but still focus so he could just hear the dripping water, so that in a fight he could focus on, just what he needed to be focused on, and the background would just be bleed out to white noise. And there's so many examples of that. Creating devices, electrical zap machines where for finger thrust could cut your hands, or you could get a pretty major electric shock if you weren't quick enough to get it in and out. This guy was training for a fight 24/7 since he was old enough. Since he was 9 years old almost. So that's why he became so good at fighting. I can't think of anyone else. I can't think of a martial arts champion, an MMA champion that trains and thinks fighting 24/7, 365 days of the year for decades at a time. They train for several, 6, 7, 8 weeks to get ready for a fight. And then afterwards it's decompression time. Bruce didn't have that. There was no off switch.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing of his childhood was something I got from this book that was like a revelation about how he was and why he was like that. Everything you just talked about. So I've got a lot of viewers who do Tai Chi, and Bruce's father was a Tai Chi practitioner, and that was his first introduction to martial arts, wasn't it, as you described? I thought that was quite interesting as well, that a lot of the philosophical side of his writing, I think, owes a lot to Tai Chi.
I would agree with that. In fact, Daniel Lee, who was a student of Bruce's in LA, was a Yang-style Tai Chi practitioner. He said that to me. And I mean, there's video. Bruce had one of these old first generation video cameras, with the big reel-to-reel tapes.
Hmm.
And you see some of them on YouTube now. There's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Herb Jackson and Danny Inosanto and all these guys in Bruce's backyard in Bel Air. What hasn't been posted yet is also from that time in Bruce's life where he filmed Dan doing the entire Yang Tai Chi for him. So he was very interested. I mean, he mentioned it in the Pierre Burton interview, Tai Chi, and thought it was a good thing for people to look after their bodies and practice it. And of course, he was very familiar with it. He practiced it not only in Hong Kong but again in Seattle. I think he also and he was also into. I don't know if it was Xingyi or not, but it was certainly breathing and meditation, and he would close his classes with that. So that was always part of it. There was this conflict within him of hard and soft, if you will. That the hard is perhaps you can attest in a grappling art, serves a certain purpose, but there are certain principles and truths from the soft art that are not invalidated by the hard art. And I think that was within him. You often see in his writings about leading the opponent to defeat himself. That's Tai Chi, right? And the yin yang symbol, even in his Jeet Kune Do emblem, why was that there? Why was the grand terminus presented in the very nucleus of his art? So I suspect that Bruce had a love for Tai Chi, but he was so obsessed with fighting that again, deflecting an opponent's incoming energy and rolling with it just didn't appeal to a young mind. It was get at it. I'm not waiting for someone to come to me. I'll initiate all of this sort of stuff. So it's funny. His fight with Nakachi in Seattle was basically a result of Bruce defending the soft arts of China. A lecture talking about how, in the Chinese perspective, the so-called internal arts or soft arts were considered superior. Again, because it was being more in accord with the Tao, right? The big things. As Alan Watts said, it was, instead of swimming against the current, you put up a sail and learn to use nature to get you to your destination. You tack, right? And
he was a karate master, wasn't he? The guy he had that fight with.
Yes, in Seattle, yeah. He was not only a karate master; he was a second-degree black belt in judo. So, I guess a mixed martial artist. And according to Jesse Glover, a pretty tough guy, a guy who fought around Seattle against people armed with knives and things like that, and was not a guy to be taken lightly. But again, I think in discussing Bruce, his obsession with fighting made him, with his own genetic attributes like speed, a phenom, a great fighter, if you will. Whereas most fighters have an aptitude for fighting, which is why they go into it, and they were very good, in some cases exceptional. But Bruce was great. He was a different level, and a lot of it has to do, I think, with the psychology. It was just there was no fear in the man, and he had this amazing speed. It had to be God-given, because a lot of people have read about his training methods and applied them, but they don't have his speed. I think it was a distance of 5 feet in 8/100ths of a second or something like that was his closest.
Yeah, it's in the book, isn't it? Yeah.
And a lot of it is, as you know, being a martial artist, if someone launches an attack at you, immediately your subconscious is on hyperdrive. What do? Do you step back? Can you block it? Can you evade it? Can you intercept it? But by the time, even though that occurs at microprocessing speed, there's a lag time between when something is perceived and when you react to it. And the problem for most people, martial artists in particular, when they stood in front of Bruce, was he was just too fast. If someone threw a looping haymaker, you have no problem. But if something's coming at you at that speed, by the time you're about to react, he's 15 feet away again after having struck you.
Yeah.
So it was an attribute that people could not defend against.
Mm.
And when you take that kind of speed with a guy who diligently practices, in some cases, thousands and thousands of, let's say, a finger jab, he will blind you, and that's just a simple fact. And there's not really much he could have done.
It's interesting that. I mean, I was lucky enough to study a bit of Wing Chun just for a few weeks with a guy local to me. And the first thing he did was show us a video of Bruce Lee. The famous bit from Enter the Dragon where he's over O'Hara and he's back cross palms, and he does that really fast sort of Pak-Sauan strike.
Right.
And he just kind of went like, that's it. That's what we're going to do. That is it. And his whole thing was very speed-based, which the narrative you tend to read about Bruce is that he started with Wing Chun and evolved it using Western methods into this other thing. And I was just struck by talking to this guy. This guy, he's a Chinese guy, and he didn't really have much English, so we had to kind of communicate through his girlfriend. And it was hilarious mistranslations all the time, which was really funny. What I was struck by was how rooted in Wing Chun, all that fast speed-based approach actually is. And I'd never really appreciated that before. I thought Wing Chun was more about sensitivity and angles, but I think a lot of it is what Bruce was doing. A lot of it is core Wing Chun. It's the very straight, fast, straight at your face. That's that sort of style.
There was a distinction between Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do. If you look, in the book, there's a photo of two of Bruce's students, one an early one a later one, Ted Wong and Taki Kimura. And look at the stance that they're in. They're completely different. Jeet Kune Do, if there was a main difference, was mobility. That was a big thing for Bruce. Wing Chun, you are like in Tai Chi, you're rooted. And it's the triangle. That's where you get your power from. And the footwork always maintains that base so that you strike with authority. It is, or was, largely I was going to say a defensive art in the sense that you responded to your opponent. And that's where the sensitivity training came in. So you would be in a position, he would make a move, and then you would react. And if you read certain parts in the book, that's what Bruce did. He would take a swing at me. As soon as the guy launched his offensive, Bruce's counteroffensive was Wing Chun. But, the thing is, once that's impressed into your neural system, it's not going away. It's not like, not going to do that anymore. If someone had grabbed him in a bar at close quarters, it would have been Wing Chun completely. It would have been, Pak-Sau, Lap-Sau strike. That was just part of his arsenal at that point. But what he did as he progressed, and again, it was about fighting to him. If it worked in a fight, that's what he was interested in, especially if it worked in a fight for someone with his attributes. So what he discovered once he was in Los Angeles was that mobility opened up new lanes of attack. You didn't have to wait for someone to come to you. Not only could you go to them, he learned from fencing with a stop hit or those principles. But if you were mobile, you didn't even need to block. Like the idea of blocking and hitting simultaneously, which is part of Wing Chun, he didn't feel that was necessary. It was good if the range permitted it, but mobility would negate the need for that. And it also opened up these lanes of attack that didn't exist when you're moving linearly. So, for example, a high kick when you're square to an opponent may not be practical, but a high kick, if you're able to move laterally, could be very effective. So Bruce started working on incorporating those elements. And as he told Dan Lee, what it amounted to essentially was, if you can move with your tools, mobility, then the easier it is to land on the opponent. And the more clumsy the opponent, the less mobile the opponent, the easier for you to pot shot it. And so as Jesse Glover called it, he was in the later stages, he was fencing with his feet. and his hands and feet. That's basically what it was. If there was a hole, he could fill it.
Hmm.
And mobility allowed him to find more holes. But to your point about Wing Chun, it never, I mean, Bruce had an affection for that art that is pretty clear. You know, in 1971 to 72, I mean, he'd written a book about it. He didn't write, you know, he took photos, thousands of photos for a book on Jeet Kune Do, but he never published it. But he did take the time to write a book on Wing Chun.
Hmm.
So Wing Chun was very dear to his heart. He agreed with a lot of the principles. I mean, in a 1969 article in the Black Belt magazine, he's demonstrating Chi Sao. So if he didn't like Wing Chun, why was he doing it? You know, why wasn't that tossed on the ash heap along with, you know, other classical methods, so-called, that he didn't find effective? So clearly, Wing Chun and its certain principles and techniques he kept, and he just found a way to apply them in some respects that hadn't existed previously. Like in 1965, he writes to his friend and assistant instructor, James Lee, that he had found a way to bridge the gap to initiate tactile strikes. Because sometimes if a guy's not going to come to you, you don't have that opportunity. But with this type of principle and footwork, he found he could initiate contact, which would allow him to implement those techniques. So
Yeah.
So Wing Chun was, I mean, a lot of Wing Chun people don't like Bruce, and it's funny, it's a love-hate there as well, because he's good for business.
Yeah.
But you know, the knock is, he never learned the whole system. And it's like, well, he learned enough of it to be able to beat the hell out of anyone that was doing Wing Chun and had learned the whole system at the time.
Yeah.
And that was all he was interested in. He didn't go into Wing Chun to learn the art and to learn about Nung Mui or the Shaolin Temple. He went into it to learn a better way to fight.
Of all his students, the one that I've always had a soft spot for is Jesse Glover. And
Yeah.
you reading your book, the quotes from Jesse Glover are brilliant, and it just makes me like him more.
Yeah.
He's so down to earth and unassuming.
Jesse, to me, was maybe one of Bruce's students who really understood Bruce. His book, Between Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do, to me, is the best biography on Bruce that's ever been written.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, and he was a knowledgeable guy. He was like a sponge. He spent so much time with Bruce, from 59 to about 62 or so, and just picked his brain. He wanted to know about Kung Fu generally, the origins of it, the practitioners of it, what the different styles did, and Bruce knew all this. He almost had an encyclopedic knowledge of it. And in particular, he wanted to learn what style of Kung Fu Bruce found to be the most effective, which of course at that time was Wing Chun. But he was also there during a lot of Bruce's development. I remember him talking about how Bruce in those early years believed in Chi and was trying to cultivate it. Whereas in his later years, he poo-pooed it. But it's very interesting there was a movie called Backbeat about the Beatles before they became the Beatles.
Yeah, I saw it.
And that's kind of how I saw Jesse in this. He was there before Bruce became Bruce.
Yeah.
And when the various personalities of the Fab Four were developing, that's when this movie was set. And it was fascinating. And I think in a similar way, that was Jesse's role. But he was very knowledgeable, and because he understood fighting in the large, he also understood Bruce's later writings and teachings, even though they differed somewhat from when he was in Seattle.
There's this fascinating bit where it's him and James DeMille are criticizing Bruce's teaching because he's holding things back. Once he opened a school and had a large number of students instead of a close group, they noticed that he was sort of holding things back and it wasn't quite the same. That's an interesting perspective. That's a real insider sort of looking at something, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, to them, I mean, Bruce was their buddy, right? So as a buddy who had this knowledge that you were interested in, he'd exchange information freely. And the classroom in those days, anywhere they happened to be. School, Jesse's house, outside a movie theater, a parking lot, Bruce would show them and answer any question they had about self-defense to the best of his ability to do so. But when he opened a school, there had to be a curriculum. There had to be some regimentation. There had to be certain lessons that were taught on a progressive basis. And all of the students had to get it to move along the path of progression. And so they found that this was not what they were interested in. They wanted the old Bruce. Hey, what do I do if a guy does this? If this comes in, is there a Chinese martial art that dealt with this? What kind of kicks did they use or that? That was out. Here's a curriculum, and if I'm not there to teach it, Taki will teach it, and we're going to learn a little bit about Chinese culture, a little bit about Chinese phraseology, a little bit about meditation, a little bit about fitness, the non-straining type of fitness, and then we're going to work on our stance, and then we're going to, it was very regimented, and that wasn't what they were interested. They were like, what do we care about meditation? They're 19 years old. They want to go into a tough area of town on Saturday night. They're not going to talk meditation with some drunken sailor at a seaport. They're going to want to know how to take the guy out in a matter of seconds. So there was that. That's kind of what led to the split of those Jesse and Bruce.
Yeah. So like one fight I've got to ask about is the Oakland one with Wong Jack Man.
Yeah.
Because that's the famous one. I mean, that's the one everyone knows about because there have been films about just that fight, haven't there?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. And also because my Tai Chi lineage is from the Wong Jack Man lineage, which I only found out years later. I kind of put the pieces together and went, oh, he was doing our style. So that was interesting. There are so many different accounts of that fight. And you've just got kind of in your book, you just run through it once. I thought what maybe you might do is run through it from different perspectives several times, but you just kind of, either you've picked one or you've put one together. Which way did it work for you?
Well, in doing that fight, for the very reasons you indicated, I amassed all of the testimony I could find on that fight, which ran to, I want to say 60 pages.
Yeah.
And then I looked for what was corroborated. Okay. And if it wasn't corroborated, it was out. And also not just corroborated as in, say, James Lee and Linda Lee, because that's they would have a bias, of course.
Yeah.
But when help me here, the fellow that basically brokered the fight, the middleman, David Chin.
David Chin, yeah.
Yeah. When he came on board, and he really didn't have skin in the game for Bruce Lee, to me it was game over on that. That looked pretty obvious, because in the early days, back when, in the 80s, when Wong's student, he wrote an official karate magazine about the fight. He presented Wong's version of the fight. It'll come to me. I think his first name is Michael, but I could be wrong. But anyway, he presented Wong's side. And then other students of Wong presented essentially an echo of what he said. Rick Wing, in his book, Showdown in Oakland. To a lesser extent, Charles Russo. And then Matthew Pauly repeated what was in Russo. But to me, in the early accounts, Chin is basically saying, hey, this is a 20-minute back and forth, and Wong Jack Man didn't use his kicks because he was a man of principle and he would have killed him. And he would have, he staggered Bruce and made him spin around once in one account and 3 times in another account. But when I put the chronology to it, there's these elements and these techniques and these exchanges that only come many, many decades after the fact. So I would go to the earliest sources, the Chinese newspapers, for example, the back and forth in the press between Bruce and Wong Jack Man or his representatives. And so you'd say, okay, that's the earliest. That's before Bruce Lee was Bruce Lee and Wong's students had skin in the game. So this holds a certain status. And then you look for the testimony from people that were there. And by far, the preponderance of evidence comes down on the side that this was not more than about 2 minutes, the fight. That Wong was taken down and that he yielded. And that was it. It wasn't, I won't say it was a decisive fight, like the fight with Nakachi in Seattle, where the guy was out cold with a fractured skull.
Yeah, covered in blood.
Yeah, this fight, this encounter should be held up as one of the most significant in North American martial arts history is preposterous. This was an exchange between two people who didn't really land, apart from Bruce's opening salvo, never really landed much in the way of an effective technique. And one guy ran out of gas at just the right time that the other guy gave up. And that was the end of the fight. And it was clearly instigated by David Chin. And I think from the Chinatown Brigade, interestingly enough, out of the Tai Chi Club. And I don't believe in doing my research that this was because Bruce had insulted traditional Chinese martial arts. I make the point in the book that this had been going on for centuries, ever since Kung Fu was taught. Some new hotshot would come in town and he'd say why his art was better than the art everyone else was practicing in town. Usually a fight would occur and the winner would get the spoils. He'd get the students and the revenue and the money. And so it was here. Bruce's mistake was that when he had come to the theater in San Francisco, he made an appeal for business. Those interested, come to my school in Oakland across the bridge. Well, that's okay. Now you're cutting into business in San Francisco. Now you're asking students that might otherwise go to some of the San Francisco seafood to, go over to what Bruce is offering. That wasn't going to fly. The masters in San Francisco, they didn't care what Bruce did or said, as long as he did it in Los Angeles or wherever he was. As soon as it went into their hometown, something had to be done. And there had already been resentment brewing toward Bruce because he'd sided with James Lee against Yoon, I believe was the fellow's practitioner's name. I could be wrong. That's my problem. When I write a book, I'm in 100% for the length of time it takes to write it. As soon as I finish, it's out of my head. But in any event, there was a resentment there about Bruce Lee. This was a young punk, essentially a university dropout who'd cozied up with dropout from, I think it was T.Y. Wong's school in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's the one.
And so they didn't care for Bruce Lee. And for him to have the gall to come into the heart of Chinatown and try and draw students away was not something they would countenance. So it was decided somebody needed to put this brash upstart in his place. And, Wong et al. Did not want to be seen as taking him seriously. Like he was the typical thing in martial arts. My sifu could kill anybody. He's so lethal. And you want to maintain that, so you don't want to engage in an encounter where that might be proven to be false. So they went on a hunt for a guy that they thought might be up to the task. It would have to be someone young like Bruce, fast like Bruce, athletic like Bruce, and someone who did a little bit more on the fighting front than push hands. So Wong Jack Man became the guy. And he didn't really know what he was getting dragged into. He was fairly new to Chinatown. He was teaching at the teaching Tai Chi. He entertained notions of opening a school. That's what he wanted to do. So suddenly all these guys became his buddies. Hey, there's this problem. We got a problem, this Bruce Lee guy, and boy, look favorably on someone that took care of that for us. And I mean, he didn't know he was being manipulated by people who thought were his friends, who basically wanted him to deal with the Bruce Lee problem on their behalf without mentioning them, so that they could be seen as not being involved. And to Wong's credit and surprise, he went 2 minutes with Bruce until he kind of recognized that, hey, this is I've been set up. And Bruce and Wong both said that after the fight. They were set up.
Yeah.
David Chin would go to Wong and say one thing, he'd go to Bruce and say something else, and then eventually, who's standing right in the middle when they collide? David Chin. So it was, it was a vicarious form of combat for the Sifu in San Francisco to hopefully get rid of this potential threat commercially.
Yeah, yeah.
And Wong was the guy they selected.
But it's interesting reading your book that, as you're saying, it was just another fight to him. We had so many
Yeah.
that it wasn't this amazing, great,
No.
revelatory experience where he finally put
No.
his art to the test, then changed everything because it didn't work. It was.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
just there were so many other fights that are probably more significant to his development as a martial artist.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, Bruce's performance in that fight wasn't exceptional. Wong certainly didn't, suffer a horrendous beating.
No, he just gave up. Didn't
Yeah.
As a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, I'm impressed that it ended up on the ground.
Yeah, and he tried to foot sweep Bruce after he gave up.
Yeah, and a naughty little sort of after the bell style.
Yeah, but it was, again, he was pissed off. Wong, you could see there's a guy who's frustrated. He's been misled.
Mm.
He was involved in an altercation that didn't need to happen, but he was led to believe that it did have to happen. And these were guys that could make his dream come true of opening a kung fu school in Chinatown. So, they knew exactly how to say what was necessary to strike a resonant chord within a young immigrant. It was shameful, but nevertheless, the certain people and Wong believed that Bruce changed his style after the fight because Wing Chun was not effective against it, or as effective as it had been. But that's really not the case.
He seemed to end up fighting a lot of guys called Wong, didn't he? A lot of guys he fought had that name because
that's true.
There's a bit at the end of the book where he's back in Hong Kong and he's challenged by Wong Shun Lung.
Yes. Yeah, that was his formal teacher in Wing Chun during the Yip Man years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and was considered the best fighter in the Wing Chun clan. By some accounts, he had, according to Jesse, what Bruce told him was he'd had over 100 fights, and hadn't lost. The Bamo. So he was a formidable and largely unsung hero of Wing Chun. But that's why Bruce liked him, was because this guy knew about fighting.
Mm.
He just know an art and know a form. He knew how to make it work in the streets, and Bruce wanted to learn that.
It seems to be more of a technical exchange type of fight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where they're sort of going like, to see how fast I am? Is this fast? How's fast that?
Yeah.
Like, can you hit my knee from there? Can you try? That sort of.
Yeah. Well, they were both like chess masters. That's kind of how I envisioned it. It was Bruce had come so far from when he was learning.
Because this is at the end of his life, isn't it?
Yeah, it was like a month or two before he died.
Hmm.
And Wong was old school Wing Chun. He was Yip Man Wing Chun. And there was animus even then about Bruce creating this mongrel martial art that didn't pay enough respect to the Wing Chun origins. So Wong was of that camp. And Bruce believed, you guys are spitting on my life's work. This is not Wing Chun, this is Jeet Kune Do. And yes, I've been quite open about how Wing Chun was the path that got me here. But, don't tell me I have not put in tens of thousands of hours to improve my fighting skills and to make a contribution to the martial arts world. So Bruce held tremendous respect for Wong Shun Lung, and Wong respected Bruce because they had, even in Wing Chun back in 1965, I believe, when Bruce was back there, they had done the sticking hands. And I mean, nobody bested Wong Shun Lung in sticking hands. He was the guy. And yet he said Bruce was scoring on him. And that never happened unless Wong wanted it to happen. So he had to respect Bruce's improvement and Bruce's skill. And finally, they had a impromptu sparring session at Bruce's house, and it was like two chess players. You know, both were very seasoned at that point, and it wasn't a fight. They both, number one, they respected each other too much for that, but it was serious. They wanted to score, but not full contact on each other in order to make a point. Bruce wanted to prove that his Jeet Kune Do was not Wing Chun, and Wong wanted to prove that yes, it was.
Yeah.
And that what you didn't know in Wing Chun, you're going to find out now. But after that, what was interesting was that it brought them closer together, as combat sports often do. Wong recognized that yes, you got something here, and in fact, I'm going to use certain elements of what you have shown me to teach my students. Because Wong was very open-minded that way about Wing Chun, as he said, it's your servant, not your master. You know, so Bruce's contributions to Jeet Kune Do through the Wong Shou Lung line changed or modified what was taught in Wing Chun, through that lineage. So that was pretty cool. You know, Bruce held Wong Shou Lung in tremendous respect, as he did Yip Man. So yeah, I guess that's my answer to that question.
So what's your own background in martial arts, John?
It's spotty. As mentioned, I took Shido-Ryu karate for a few years, boxed, but very, very low level boxing, wrestled, took a little bit of Tai Chi with Dan Lee, studied Jeet Kune Do with Ted Wong, dabbled in Wing Chun. But it's one of those things that, as much as the martial arts, they beckon me. And then once I'm in them, I always get this question that comes into my mind, which is, why are you training for a fight you'll never have?
yeah, the eternal question. Yeah.
So, consequently, I've never been able to answer that satisfactorily to the left hemisphere of my brain, so I tend to step back and not pursue it. You know, but then I'll see something like some guy doing a Tai Chi form on a beach with the sun in the background. And say, oh, I want that, and then I want to, see if I can make the bridge, between the beauty and the poetry and motion of Tai Chi with the hard facts I know to be true about physiology.
Yeah.
And I remember when Liu Fang was alive, he created a method of qigong and weight training called qi feng, and I thought that's kind of cool. Yeah, I could get into that, but then I don't know. It comes and it goes with me. It's like,
yeah, but that's fair enough. I mean, like anything, you have to enjoy it, don't you? I mean, that's the only thing that keeps me going. If I wasn't enjoying it, I'd just stop doing it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if people enjoy it, I mean, I'm not judging it. I'm just, for me, that's my internal conflict that I've always had.
Yeah. I did Jeet Kune Do in the Ted Wong lineage as well for a couple of years over in the UK. So I'm very familiar with that style of Jeet Kune Do, the stance.
Yeah.
Point the fist at their face, not in the air, all that drilled into you. And I'm ever since then, I'm right-handed, but I stand like a southpaw when I fight, because it was just drilled into me so often that the right hand is strong hand forward, and I to me, I can't do it the other way around now. It just feels wrong.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm the same way.
Yeah.
I now an orthodox stance just doesn't feel right to me.
No, I feel instantly adrift.
Yeah.
Actually, my leg kicks are probably stronger because my right leg is behind me now, and I can you've got more distance to cover when you strike. But my hands just feel wrong. I can't jab with my left hand at all. It's just sort of does that instead of going in a straight line.
I know. Yeah, it's the same thing. Steve Martin said that about philosophy. He said, with philosophy, you learn just enough to screw you up for the rest of your life. And I found that with Jeet Kune Do, that once you do have that drilled into you, power side forward, and this and that, then neuromuscularly, nothing else feels
Yes, exactly. Because we weren't really very big on sparring. There wasn't much sparring, but what there was a lot of were drilling, like with pads. You know,
Yeah,
so it was drilled into you like
which is
relentlessly.
interesting because Bruce was very big on sparring. Uh,
Right.
he it was he did have pads, of course, kicking shields and stuff like that, but that was for you to get the neuromuscular coordination to do that, and then it was sparring, and but again, that was Bruce, right? And that's one of the mistakes most people make in the martial arts is they believe that by doing A, they will become somebody else. They will somehow not be them. They'll be, what they are will be discarded to become what they're impressed by.
Hmm.
I've seen it in bodybuilding. I've seen it in martial arts. And Bruce Lee, of course, is the guy. I mean, who didn't want to be Bruce Lee at one point? Someone had said, hey, listen, we will totally efface you. You will not exist, but you will become Bruce Lee. 99.9% of the practitioners would have taken that. But unfortunately, it's a fool's paradise because Bruce was Bruce. He had his natural attributes that we generally don't possess. There will be some that have other attributes that Bruce didn't have, and that would be their strengths to play to. But with Bruce, he was self-aware enough that he knew what his attributes were and how to optimize them. I mean, try as you will, you're not going to have his speed. You can figure out how he trained and do it diligently. But if you don't have that genetic gift, then you're heading down the wrong path.
Brilliant. Well, I've really enjoyed reading your book, Wrath of the Dragon. It's fantastic and so well researched. Really impressed by the level of research you've done for this.
Oh, well, thank you, Graham.
Yeah. So, what's next? What's next for you?
Well, I'm working on a biography of a bodybuilder friend, mentor of mine, Mike Menser, who was blacklisted in the bodybuilding community and became a victim of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Weider brothers. He challenged their dominion. But he was a friend of mine and also a guy who injected reason and logic into a sport or an activity that sorely needed it. It was an industry based on, since its inception, on commercial interests.
Hmm.
But Mike died in 2001, and I've seen a lot of people sort of running down a friend of mine, and I just thought enough's enough. And as with the Bruce Lee book, this will be heavily footnoted. That's the book I'm working on now.
Oh, interesting. I watched that Arnie documentary recently, the one that was on Netflix.
Mm.
Because I mean, bodybuilding's not my world, and I don't know much about it. So it was interesting. It was his perspective on everything, obviously,
Yeah.
but it was interesting to get a view into that world.
Yeah. Well, it was. It was an interesting. It's funny. I got into that world through Bruce Lee, actually, of all things, because
Hmm.
I was impressed with his physique. At some point, I recognized I wasn't. That as a fighter, I was a pretty good writer. So I knew that I didn't have a career in unarmed combat, but everyone can look after their physiques and try and be in better shape. And the bodybuilding world at the time was the only one that spoke to that. It was used to have bodybuilding publications, and there were bodybuilders of various shapes and sizes and weights, and I looked for ones that looked close to how Bruce Lee looked, and gravitated toward it, and then came to find out that Bruce Lee likewise did the same thing.
Mm.
So that became an interest, and from my humble perspective, it was eminently more practical in terms of the physiological benefits that came back to me than was my training for a fight that I'd never had. So that's the book I'm working on presently. I suspect it will take me another 8 months of writing and research before.
I should look out for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds good. Interesting. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, John.
And you, Graham.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with all our listeners too.
You're very welcome, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
You can find out more about the Tai Chi Notebook podcast at www.thetaichinotebook.com.